But the more I study this topic, the more I'm amazed at how beautifully the Testaments fit together to create this cohesive image of Jesus that is faith-building and strengthening, and it just makes you marvel at the wisdom of God in all this. When Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, they decided they wanted to stone him. Now, somebody who doesn't speak Old Testament might not know what that is. I think you guys speak Old Testament, and you already know that what he's doing here is something that offended them greatly. And they had in their mind, they knew it very well, of course. They knew what Exodus taught. They knew the story in Exodus 3. They knew about that time when Moses was in the wilderness, and he was keeping the sheep and all that, and he encounters this bush that's burning. It's not being consumed, and Moses is flabbergasted by it, and he approaches it, and of course God speaks to him out of that burning bush. Take your sandals off, you're standing on holy ground. And Moses and God have this discussion there. God telling Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt to rescue the people. And Moses offers some excuses. One of them is, who am I going to tell them sent me? They're not going to believe me. And God in that dialogue says, tell them, I am that I am sent you, which is remarkable. It's just, God is going to be known as, I know you've heard the word Yahweh, and you've seen it, the YHWH, all caps, God reveals himself as Yahweh, the I am that I am. And Yahweh has to do with something like existing, being. And it's a fascinating thing because this nature to be, this thing to be, it carries with it the idea of always existing. And so it didn't simply used to exist, it simply exists of its own nature. It is the uncaused cause. I am, I am sent you. Tell them that. So God has always been, he will always be, he simply is. Tell them I am. It's kind of an awkward way of saying it. Tell them I am sent you. Because he's the self-existing being, the only self-existing being. So when Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am, they knew exactly what he was doing. He was telling them that he is to be equated with God. He is God. He is the eternal creator being. He's Yahweh. That's who he is. They were offended by that, as they should have been, if he was making a claim that wasn't true. But you go through that in the Gospel of John, you'll see those kinds of statements. John is the one that expresses this more clearly than the other gospel writers. I am the resurrection and the life in the tomb of Lazarus. I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd in John 10. I am the way, the truth, and the life, John 14. Just over and over again. There's one that's a little bit more subtle, I think, that fascinated me when I studied it a couple years ago. When Jesus walked on the water, it's a famous story, of course. But the disciples are out there, the sea's getting rough, and they look out there and they see Jesus walking on the water to them. It's told in Matthew and Mark. And there's it's Mark's version of the story who makes this little statement. It says that he intended to pass by them. So he's walking on the water, and Matthew doesn't, but Mark tells us this, that Jesus apparently is just going to walk by them, which seems kind of weird. But when you speak Old Testament, when you dive into this and you start seeing some connections there, it's a fascinating thing because the book of Psalms actually said that God treads on the water. And it also says for example, it says in 1 Kings and also in the book of Exodus that God passed by Elijah. That Exodus 34, he passed by Moses. Remember when Moses said, Lord, I need my faith is a little bit weak. I need you to show me yourself. This is Exodus 33 and 34. And God says, well, you can't see me, but I'll cover you in the cleft of the rock, and then I'll pass by you. And it says that in Exodus 33 and Exodus 34, God passed by him, and he said, I am the Lord, merciful and gracious, just revealing himself to Moses. And he also has one of those where he passes by Elijah. The language is very, very similar to the way Mark puts it with Jesus treading on the water. That's Psalms. God is the one who treads on the water. Only God can do that. Jesus comes treading on the water, and he's going to pass by them. Well, when you speak Old Testament, you know, that's what he did in front of Elijah the prophet. That's what he did in front of Moses the prophet, the lawgiver. And so who is this? And finally, they're afraid. And you remember what Jesus says to them? He says, don't be afraid. It is I. I am. See, these little connections with these Old Testament things of God passing before Elijah, God passing before Moses, God saying, I am. And Jesus walks on the water, treading on the water, and he says, it is I am. Just so many of these connections between the Old Testament that you kind of miss out on if you don't spend the time that's needed to connect them and to see these things. See, that isn't, especially that one about walking on the water, that is not one you're going to pick up if you're looking at quotations, or it's not going to be pointed out. It's just when these people are steeped in something, they see these connections, and that's another beautiful one. All through the Gospel of John, you know, the I am statements, and then Revelation, the Alpha and the Omega. He is the great I am. A lot of the Old Testament passages are going to help us to see this connection of Jesus with the I am, that he is God. Sometimes there are critics who say the New Testament doesn't always clearly teach the deity of Jesus. Those people aren't aware of the various ways that the New Testament teaches the beauty of the identity of Jesus as the Son of God. Remember Matthew 17, when Jesus went up on the mountain of transfiguration with Peter, James, and John? Remember that story? And he was transfigured before them, right? Transfigured before Peter, James, and John. And Peter, because he didn't know what to say, probably shouldn't have said anything. But he didn't know what to say, and so he spoke. Remember what he said? Let's make 3 tents. Let's build 3 tents. One for Moses, one for Elijah, one for Jesus, one for you. To which God quickly responded. Okay, hang on a second here, Peter. This is my beloved Son. Hear him. Listen to him. And when you read that Matthew 17 text, and you get this image, you know, you got Moses, who was the great lawgiver. I mean, the Jewish people respected him immensely, representing the law. And you've got Elijah, the great prophet, you know, chariots of fire. I mean, you've got that Elijah representing the school of prophets. You got Moses, the lawgiver. You got Elijah, the great prophet. And you got God saying to Peter, James, and John there, this is my Son. You listen to him. But then you see that kind of echoed throughout the scriptures. You see places like Matthew 5, some parallels between what Jesus does and what Moses did. When Moses in Exodus 19 and 20 went up on the mountain, received the law from God, and gave it to the people, right? In Matthew 5, Jesus goes up on the mountain. He doesn't receive it from God because he is God, but he goes up on the mountain and he delivers it to the people. You see connections like, remember Jesus he was walking about going from here to there, and he saw this funeral procession, the little town called Nain. The widow of Nain had lost her son, and Jesus interrupted the funeral procession, brought the son back to life. People said he's a prophet. Of course, they understood that he's doing what Elijah and Elisha did, both of them in the Old Testament. When Elijah went to the widow's house and raised her son, Elisha, following his master's footsteps, did the same thing. And yet Jesus comes along and he does prophet sorts of things, you know. He's the great Elijah. He's the great Elisha. He's the great Moses, the great lawgiver. He's the one who doesn't have to go up on the mountain and receive it from God, but the one who he is the giver of the law himself. And so you see these ties, these not only, you know, verbal kind of ties, but these thematic ties that when you start really diving into the Old Testament text and you read the New Testament you read the Old Testament in light of what Jesus would do and who he came to be, you start seeing these connections that I think are remarkable. One more Moses tie before we move on. It's like the John 6 and 7, well, John 6 especially, when Jesus multiplies the fish and the loaves for the crowd that's hungry. And, you know, I don't know if you've ever thought about the ties between that and the Old Testament, but the people there wanted to make him king because he's someone who, like Moses, can bring about feeding of the crowd. You've got in the Old Testament, the book of Exodus, that God used Moses to deliver the manna and the quail, right? The bread and the meat, the bread and the protein. And Jesus comes along and he is the one who gives the bread and he gives the meat to the crowd. They want to make him king, but he goes on in the next section there and he says, I not only bring you bread and meat, but I bring you the sustenance that will never end. And so he says, you eat my body and drink my blood. He's saying that which Moses could not do, I do for you. And so these ties, you know, that Moses could do this, but Jesus not only feeds them physically, but he gives his body and his blood to sustain them eternally. He's the great Moses, the greater Moses. He's the greater Elijah. You know, I love this thing. I don't know if you've noticed this before, but you take Matthew, and this is one that'll never come out. You never notice this if you're just looking for quotations or whatever, but you see this pattern in early chapters in Matthew. For example, Matthew 3. Remember what? At the end of Matthew 3, 13 through 17, Jesus went to John the Baptist and he was baptized of John. Remember that? Matthew 4, first verse of Matthew 4, he's driven by the Spirit into the wilderness where he's tempted of the devil for 40 days, 40 nights, you know. And we have the record of the temptations there. That's Matthew 4. In Matthew 5, Jesus goes on to the mountain and he delivers the law to the people. He delivers the Sermon on the Mount to the people. There's this interesting progression there of baptism, temptation, and the giving of the law that in pretty interesting ways parallels the experience of Israel in the book of Exodus when they left Egypt and they went into the Red Sea. Paul, even himself in 1 Corinthians 10, says that was a baptism. They went into the Red Sea, waters on either side, water, the cloud of water above them. They were immersed unto Moses, Paul tells us, in the Red Sea. Remember, they came through the Red Sea. They were delivered from their slavery, liberated. They go into the wilderness. God gives them the law. They experience this time of wandering for 40 years, and which, in those 40 years, I think you know the answer to this. How well did Israel do in the wilderness of temptation? Terribly. Read Numbers, you know. It was awful. It was awful. Even Moses, of course, gave in to the pressures of the day and disobeyed God. I mean, it was ugly. Acts of rebellion. They were tempted and they succumbed to the temptation. Jesus went into the waters of baptism in Matthew 3, went into the wilderness. The number 40, of course, is no coincidence. Went into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. And in every respect, he did what God's son Israel could not do. He passed every test. And he came through the wilderness temptation, proving himself as the son of God that Israel could never be. And you remember the Old Testament, Israel was called the son of God, right? Multiple times. In fact, that's why God killed the firstborn son, the firstborn of everybody in Egypt, because Egypt had persecuted and killed his son, Israel, put them into slavery. And so God's response to that was in the 10th plague, you know, the killing of the firstborn, just as Egypt had done. But then that also looked ahead, of course, to the Son. God so loved the world that whoever believes in him, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, his one and only Son. You know, he's a son that Israel could never be. See the connections there. I just think are really beautiful. Israel, and God knew this, of course, but Israel could never be what God wanted them to be, what they were created to be. But that story's told so that we might see the Son of God who fulfilled in every respect what Israel could never accomplish. You know, these things that we learn about Jesus when we look closely at this reading of the Old Testament, these fulfillment of one that only pointed to Christ. And so the high priest, Aaron, was a man who was flawed. His sons, of course, were flawed. The descendants of Aaron, all the high priests, all the priestly system, these were men who were deeply flawed. And as the writer of Hebrews said, they first had to offer sacrifices for their own sins and then for the sins of the people. And yet Jesus came along, and he offered not a lamb. He didn't burn incense. Rather, he offered himself as the sacrifice, which is, the next one is that he's the one who sacrifices and the one who is sacrificed. He is both priest and offering. And in order for us to realize just the depth of his sacrifice and understand the significance of that, we've got to be conversant in the Old Testament description of how God related to Israel, right? Amen. When you look at the Old Testament, there are a number of characters who stand out. Of course, one of them would be Abraham, Moses. Another would be David. You read in 2 Samuel 7 about David. About God coming to David. David has said, Lord, I want to build you a house. I want to build you a temple. It's not right for the ark to dwell in, temporary housing, so to speak, when I could build you a house. And God said, no, you're not going to build me a house, but I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to build you a house. Of course, he's talking about the lineage of David, this dynasty, that David's son would reign, and his grandson would reign, and so on. That the nation of Judah would have a Davidic descendant on the throne, And so God says, I'm gonna build you a house. But in that promise that he made to David, 2 Samuel 7, he refers quite clearly to one who's going to be different. One who's going to be the fulfillment of the Davidic line. And it's fascinating. It's one of the reasons you just read the Old Testament and these, I just think it's the ties that come through are fascinating. But one of them is, I remember being surprised when I was reading through the Old Testament about David, how, David was flawed in so many ways. I mean, you look at what David did. I mean, I think I could make a case that what David did in some respects was worse than what Saul did. I mean, Saul disobeyed God, but David, stole this man's wife and then had him murdered. And I mean, David he broke 2 of the 10 commandments right there on the spot. Could have been put to death. But anyway, David was deeply flawed. And yet, from David throughout the rest of the Old Testament, every king after him will be compared to him. So he'll say, the writer, the narrator will say something like, he walked in the footsteps of his father David, or he did not walk in the footsteps of his father David. But when God gives us this clue in 2 Samuel 7, he points to one who is to come, who will be the king that David could never be. But God chose David. David was, God referred to him as a man after God's own heart. Of course, you know about David's commitment of faith, and David was in so many ways a follower of God, submitted to God, but he was so deeply flawed. And then Solomon was worse. And then you just look at this. It's a litany of men who failed to be the king. And then that last week often called Palm Sunday now, that Sunday before the crucifixion of Jesus, when Jesus tells the disciples what to do, they're preparing. He comes into Jerusalem riding on the back of a donkey. It's absolutely amazing, because that should have let them know that if he's a king, he's going to be a different kind of king than David. He's going to be a different kind of king than his predecessors. His kingdom is going to be one that is ruled by servant leadership of Jesus. He comes into town, not riding on the back of a white stallion, but riding on the back of a donkey. I mean, that image of humility, and the braying of a donkey, and and the esteem which donkeys would get. Yet Jesus, the King, comes riding into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. You know, it's this fascinating thing that this is the great King. What do we learn from that? Of course, 3 or 4 days after this, he's got to get down on his knees and he's going to wash the feet. King of all the earth is washing the feet of his disciples. What do we learn from that? It's a different kind of kingdom.
Amen.
It's a different kind. A greater king than David. I think this is mostly what Jesus was alluding to in Luke 24. There's so many ways in which this is stated. You can go to passages like Isaiah 53, which is probably one of the clearest in the Old Testament about the suffering servant. Passages like the book of Psalm 22, about the piercing of hands and feet, being betrayed by his friends, and so on. But when you get to Luke 24 and you hear what Jesus said to the disciples, didn't you read? Don't you understand that in the Old Testament, what we have here, the Word of God teaching us, is that there is one who is coming. And so that Passover, of course, that was meant for the Israelites to signify the deliverance of God from this slavery. The 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, killing of the firstborn, the male of 1 year without blemish, taking the blood and putting it on the doorpost, the angel of death passing over the houses, and if there was blood on the door, he passed over and there's no death in the house. Of course, that is still celebrated by Jews to this day to signify this great act of deliverance of God from their captivity, from their slavery. And yet, of course, Jesus on that Thursday night, when he took the disciples into that upper room, and he took that wine, and he took that bread, and he said, this represents for you something more than deliverance from slavery. For years and years, for generations and generations, that bread signifying the bread that they made at the Passover, that wine, signifying the blood of the lamb that was poured out here in Egypt. And yet now, I'm about to give this new meaning. You see, these tithes, we can understand the Last Supper. We can understand it superficially. We can understand it. We can understand that Jesus, we can take the Lord's Supper without understanding Passover. We can take communion and we can understand the bread and the wine on some level, but you see how it just gives us a robust faith when we understand this is not just a meal. This is not just Jesus taking some things they had at the meal and saying, this meal represents something. There were hundreds and hundreds of years of history behind that. And when you are steeped in Old Testament, when you read the book of Exodus, when you memorize passages from Exodus, and when this is a part of your culture and a part of your history, just the significance of Jesus saying, this represents something different now for you. Can you imagine how life-altering that would have been?
Amen.
And we miss out on some of that. Obviously, we're not Jewish. We don't have that history. But what we can do is we can steep ourselves in Old Testament, the Word of God, to the point that we just instinctively appreciate on a deeper level what God has done for us and the beauty of the story. It just, I've shared this a time or two. I don't talk about it a lot back, at church, but I lost my faith when I was a young, when I was last couple years in high school and my first year at Free Hardeman. I say I lost it. I guess on some level I believed, but not really, I guess, because I think biblically when you believe, then actions follow, and so I wasn't living the life of a believer. And I think some of it was just like pushing back against my upbringing. Like I'm gonna do things my own way. I'm not gonna do this just because my parents want me to do it, that sort of thing. What brought me back to faith, and I think what keeps me in faith, in spite of we live in a secular environment, all sorts of challenges and all that, is I don't see any possible way to to explain the beauty of the story that you find in Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. We're going to talk about that in the next session after lunch. But just the faith-strengthening, life-shaping beauty of the story that is just told. But you miss out on it. It's told so beautifully, but you just miss out on it if you start Matthew 1. You just don't get it. I know there are God-fearing, obedient, faithful Christians whose understanding of the Old Testament is very shallow or almost non-existent, perhaps. But we don't want to stay there. Amen. We don't want to stay there. So the next one after lunch, we're going to talk about that last point from my first class, and that is just about the robustness of a faith that is fully informed by both Testaments. I'm looking forward to sharing that with you after lunch. All right, thank you so much.